And welcome to the CodeX Cantina. I am Una.
And I am your evening sun, Crypto.
Oh, that's so adorable. The way you brought in another text. An intertextual reference for the drawing of three. All right, we are breaking down part 3 in our 5-part series on the drawing of the three by Stephen King. This week we are covering basically The Lady of Shadows through chapter 3. So we didn't read chapter 4 at this point, and we're going to break this part down, and I think we got some good stuff, particularly for those out there that there might be some people that didn't really resonate with Odetta and Detta. I think if we talk through this, I think if we bring out some of what was happening in the 60s, I'm hoping that maybe those people that there's those people that love it, and the people that were like, I didn't connect with this chapter, let us bring in some of what was happening here, and I think you may enjoy this a little bit more.
I think this is the perfect example of how Stephen King uses real history to drive his narrative, which is even better for world building, and I think really does give you a sense of how out of the world Roland is.
No, it's very different. It's very different. I can understand how someone couldn't connect with this section, particularly with Detta. The way that is written, that's called stream of conscious writing. And you and I have loved it. You and I have both really, we're in on it when it comes to like William Faulkner and stuff like that, right?
And I've grown to appreciate that, and I've had to work at it. It's not something that came naturally, and a lot of that's been from your help. So yeah, I could get how somebody couldn't, but I don't see why somebody wouldn't want to. Does that make sense?
Sure. But you agree, It took effort in the beginning.
Yes.
To work through that stream of conscious, right?
Yeah.
So let me do a quick recap of what happened in these chapters. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rearrange these to be kind of like in order that they happened in universe, because it's not explained chronologically in the book. So let me rearrange that and see if that helps. But basically the idea is at age 5, I think it was, well, at a young age, Odetta Holmes was going to visit her Aunt Sophia. And she was getting married. There's the special blue plate, the 4 special plate, which we don't know what that is exactly yet from this chapter's, is being given to her. And as she's walking away, a man throws a brick and pops her on the head, and that creates this traumatic event where she starts having this alternate schizophrenic personality come out. Okay? Flash forward, she's joined the civil rights movement, which Odetta Holmes is a real person in the civil rights movement, if you didn't know. And she once again gets caught up in this very traumatic event where she's pushed onto the subway and loses both of her legs in a terrible accident. So this further complicates her schizophrenic issue with basically having this alternate personality, Detta, coming out, and you see the scene with the EMS people fighting over this really aggressive Detta and this really sweet civil rights intelligent Odetta Holmes persons. So we kind of keep going through, flash forward, and eventually we get to she's being driven home after just visiting Oxford. It's frequently referred to as Oxford Town. We'll get into that in our talking points. But Andrew, her driver, kind of drops her off, and he's like, hey, this is weird. She kind of disappears for days at a time, has weird excuses. Well, she flips back to Detta again. She gets that headache. She goes to Macy's, apparently does some jewelry shopping, does a little 5-finger discount, and that's when Roland, he's coming to enter into her body. He has this argument with Eddie, and Eddie's like, don't leave me. I'm going to slit your throat if you leave me. He leaves him. Way to go, Roland. Real nice guy, right?
Yeah.
And so he takes into to Detta's mind, and then Detta doesn't like the white man. Very resistant and very racist, and has this issue because she kind of knows something's going on, and they cause a scene, and her stealing of the jewelry comes out. Security guard chases her into a changing room, and before the changing guard knocks the door open, Eddie and Roland pull him into their world. So once they're through the portal, the security guard breaks in, and the room's empty. And Eddie starts to get to know Odetta. Roland goes to get some water. His disease is getting worse without, antibiotics. And when he returns and he sees Eddie being a little close to Odetta, who refuses to believe that this is reality, he kind of pulls Eddie aside and says, hey, you need to be careful. She's got a dangerous other side, if you will. So that's the rearrangement of what happens in this, which can be confusing for some people. So hopefully that helps for those that needed that recap. Let's jump into our discussion, shall we?
Yes, sir.
All right, let me kick this off real quick, and I'm going to throw it over to you.
All right.
But the Alfred Adler quote in the beginning is obviously very important. And I think people, when they read this, they read that and they're like, oh, okay, so he's talking about schizophrenia and stuff like that. But what Stephen King chose to do here with the real world, as Crypto talked about, is really, really important to understanding that. And our history buff, Crypto, is going to break that down. But I wanted to point this out, that he was a real psychologist. And one of his greatest theories in psychology was called individual psychology, which says that this alternate being can be created and developed from a feeling of being inferior. So keep that in mind as Crypto breaks that down, that feeling of inferior creating this alternate personality. Mr. Crypto?
All right, so I think the most important thing is that we have to, again, take a second and realize that it would be difficult to enjoy this part if you don't know some history. And that's why it's so important to know your history. And King is drawing upon our own history to develop his story further and enrich his story. He chose, I think, Odetta in a specific time period in the 1950s and 60s, set specifically in New York City. And I think that he sets it specifically here because of the civil rights tensions that are going on. And he didn't pick the 70s or the 80s, which a lot of his stories take place in. I think he was very, very careful in choosing that time period. 1960s is usually referred to as the decade of violence. There's a few years in there that around our country and the world are considered modernly. We're not talking, crusades and all the fighting and everything like that. But for domestic violence, the most violent time period in modern world history. There's all kinds of riots and protests and lots of changes happening around the entire world. And not just the United States, but in the United States, this is especially true for Black communities. And so I think it is very, very important that we understand why he's setting it in this time frame.
Right. I mean, they're pushing hard to end racial discrimination and pushing for equal rights under law at this time in American history, right?
Yeah. And so in the story, he has this lady who is based on a real person, Odetta, that has some own personal experiences with this. And then she gets, caught up in, who couldn't, Dr. King being one of the great orators ever. I mean, he was just, the way he spoke was so elegant and amazing. She's pulled into that.
But I'll say, there's a really good quote from this section. There was more work to be done. Hate would not help do that work. Hate would, in fact, hinder it. But sometimes you went on hating just the same. And you saw Odetta go through this trip to Oxford Town, as they say it. Let me bring in a couple musical references to kind of support that civil rights movement that you were just kind of talking about. Do you know what the Oxford Town song by Bob Dylan's about?
Yeah, so that was James Meredith, and he was... I can't remember exactly.
This was right after a lot of the segregation laws saying that separate but equal was not legal or lawful. And he was the first Black man to be entered into Ole Miss, Mississippi at the time. And there were riots. 300 people died at the time. So this is talking still to that civil rights movement and that source of identity that Odetta and Dutta are going through. There's when she got into the crash. Here's another reference. The A Train, Duke Ellington's A Train is called out. And what that song's about is at that time, Sugar Hill was kind of like the Mecca, not in a religious sense, but in a cultural and liberal and expressionism's perspective. That was the height of America for the Black community, and is the up place to live where a lot of famous people lived. And they took the A train from that place down to Manhattan, and there was a big meeting of the black community coming to cities at this point in time to support the world wars and to support efforts that there's a clash of cultures. And you see that represented in this story too, with her kind of being pushed by someone into the subway train, which is, there's obviously some concerns and bringing up of hate crimes with, who was it that pushed her and who was it that threw the brick at the time. That you see this layers upon layers upon layers. Stephen King is showing a struggle of identity between Odetta and Detta, between the whites and the blacks at the time, between the civil rights, like legal law and just humanitarian needs. It's just a very intense part of the book. Much different from the heroin addiction part, correct?
Yeah, and there's a lot less action here, I think, too. So this is, to some people, this can be considered kind of the lull part. We're coming down off the high. See what I did there? Of the action.
I like it.
Of Eddie and Roland. Additionally, Odetta has had these two very traumatic experiences. The very first one, getting hit in the head with a brick, and that breaking her mind and creating Detta, I think, to try to cope with what was happened to her. And then the second one, she is savagely maimed, where she's pushed in front of the train by an anonymous figure, right? And I think that anonymous person who she has no connection to kind of, is the standard for what has happened to many black people in the civil rights movement, where people just hate them and they don't even know why. They don't even know these people. And I think that King does a magnificent job of telling these very high-intensity racial stories, because he goes on later and explores this in The Green Mile, right? Where John Coffey is an angel angel-like figure, and he's represented by a black man in the 1940s, right before all this starts. So I think the King does a good job of using this as a driving tool through his story. And I can see where somebody, if they didn't have all that knowledge about the things that you discussed and I discussed, this would definitely be the story coming down and losing some of its luster, so to speak, right?
Well, let's say this. Let's assume I hire you to be my screenwriter. If you looked at this and how it just starts with Andrew in the car coming back, I'm not sure that, from a cinematic standpoint, I'm not sure that's the right starting place. I think you have to either do a very postmodern approach where you start from that shoplifting scene and really play and jump around with time to work backwards into how we ended up here, kind of like Memento, but not that specific. Or you really got to start from the beginning of getting hit with a brick and explaining the story, but you're going to have to cut out some stuff along the way. I don't have an issue with the way it's written from a brick, but from a traditional storytelling perspective, to make this work on film, you're really going to have to change some things.
Yeah, and I think because the way it's written, and if someone didn't have a lot of background knowledge, this part of the story definitely does not feel as comprehensive within the story as Eddie's did, right? You need more. Yeah. You need more,
yes,
like.
Do. Yeah.
Let me start over. You need more pre-work before reading this section to enjoy it maybe as much as we have.
And that can turn some people off, right?
Yeah. And I think that I love Odetta and Detta as my favorite character because they are the most real. They're based on real people. And maybe there's some awful stereotypes in there, but I think that he does a good job of using that. So
yeah, I think there's even that line where he's talking about Detta, where I don't think, if you're trying to write like a racially charged and upset black woman, I don't think Stephen King made Detta the best, most realistic, but they did throw in that line there where he said like she's almost like a cartoon character. And that made it a lot more acceptable for me.
I think that he is not the right person to write it, maybe.
No.
White guy from Maine. But
yeah,
I think that he does it with enough tact to warrant it, to justify it.
Well,
I mean,
I think about, he was born in 1947, so he was in his 20s when this was happening. He was aware and intelligent, but to your point, he's in Maine. You know, he's not living in Tennessee or Alabama when this is happening.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right. He may not be the best person, but I think it's okay. I think he tried, and I think he did a good enough job. All right, let's talk about, this will be real quick, but the snake analogy. Did you notice how many times he brought up a snake when he was talking about Detta?
I don't remember that.
Yep, a couple times. When they're flipping back and forth in the ambulance, that is being compared to being bitten by a copperhead snake. And then later, Roland describes her as snake-like. And then when they talk about being in the brains and they talk about being in Eddie's, it's like being in a sweaty room. When they talk about being in Detta's, I think it's Detta's. I don't think it's Odeta's, but one of the two, it feels like being covered in snakes. 3 references at least
to the serpents.
Yes. So it'll be interesting to see where he goes with this. But from a biblical standpoint, snakes are not good, right?
Snakes are not good,
right?
Yeah.
And we have the return of Roland from the beach where he says, "Watch out for that Detta." So, I can't remember how well, I know what happens, and I won't spoil it, but I can't remember how well this constant bringing up of her character being like a snake is used in the next part. I can't remember that part.
Now, is he used specifically Copperheads? Because that is could be reference to a group of politicians, the Copperheads, who kind of flipped on their own kind, their own political affiliation.
Two of them were snakes.
Okay.
Only one was referred to as a copperhead, but that's an interesting parallel as well.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything there. If he specifically said Copperhead every single time, then I would maybe make note of it that he was specifically using that type of snake. But if he just does it once, maybe he just saw a cool picture of a Copperhead, or just thought it sounded neat or something. So probably nothing there. All right, so the last thing, I think, to continue supporting your theory, our theory, of building a case for it on the theory of H and 4. There is one time where Eddie is going off and he says the word hysterical, and Roland specifically says, "I don't understand what you mean." And there's one other H word that he says, that he says, "I just don't understand what Eddie says sometimes, but I get his meaning. I get his drift." And so there was, I can't remember the other word, but there were definitely 2 H words again that Roland does not know. So I think it's just lending more support to our theory.
Yeah, I missed that. So that's really interesting, and that leads credence to the lowercase h, if you will, representing the 4, which you can't see right now. Beautiful. I missed those. So that'd be interesting to watch again on another reread.
Yeah, you got me looking for them now. It's like a scavenger hunt.
All right, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's session. We had a fun time reading it, and we can't wait for the next part where we are reading chapter 4 of the final chapter of The Lady of Shadows, and we're going to go through the Pusher, but we're not reading chapter 1 after the Pusher. We're just reading the Pusher section and then stopping, and that'll be part 4 of our 5-part series. So please subscribe and hit the bell to make sure that you don't miss out on those. Please let us know what you thought and what your theories are if you're reading this at the same time, and peace out.
Peace.